Hello, this is Mrs. Kinder. Welcome. We're going to be talking today about the story Thank You Ma'am, written by Langston Hughes. For this lesson, I'm actually using a combination of two strategies from the Chris Tovani book. This one, Do I Really Have to Teach Reading? For this, what I decided to do is I had been reading her chapter on instructional purpose, and I knew I wanted to teach this story. So I used some of the questions, actually all of the questions that she has under the instructional purpose worksheet to work through those questions and decide what the best strategy would be for teaching what I wanted to teach for this story, and determined then that the graphic organizer strategy I would like to use from her book is the double entry diary. So that's what we'll actually be using in class. And examples of that graphic organizer are included with the lesson that I'm submitting through Blackboard. So let's get to it. Welcome everyone. Let's talk about the short story Thank You Ma'am, written by Langston Hughes. I always like to begin any lesson with a new piece of literature by talking a little bit about context. I think one of the best ways to do that is to talk about the author of the story, and in this case it's Langston Hughes. He was an African-American writer born in 1902. He died in 1967. He was one of the founding fathers of the Harlem Renaissance and is very well known for that. And he wrote a lot about the African-American experience. And that's exactly what this story is about that we're going to be talking about today. So what we're going to do as we're reading this story is we're going to consider the two characters in this story. One of them is named Roger. He's a young man, a teenager. And the other is a woman who is an older lady. And her name, she has a long name, so I'm going to make sure I get it right by reading it. Mrs. Luella Bates Washington Jones. And when the two of them meet, it's not in a very good way. They meet in conflict. And then throughout the course of the story, their relationship changes and develops. And by the end of the story, it's almost like what you might say is a friendship. So the question becomes, how do we start this story in such conflict with these characters and end up with them having this connection, unlikely connection? And I think we can discover the reasons for that best by exploring character motivation. So that's what we'll be doing today. We're going to be talking about character motivation. And we're going to be examining Roger's motivation and Mrs. Jones' motivation. And I'll talk about how we're going to do that in just a second. Now, normally at this point in the class, we would be reading the story aloud, taking turns. It would take us probably about 5 to 7 minutes, but we're going to skip ahead, assume that we have already read this short story, and that we're ready to get right into the strategy that we're going to use to uncover our character motivation. Okay, class, so here's what we're going to do. I'm dividing the room in half. This side of the room, you're going to be thinking about Roger. This side of the room is going to be thinking about Mrs. Jones. So if you open up your iPad and you open up the folder under Thank You Ma'am for Langston Hughes, you're going to find a blank document. It's not totally blank, but it's blank for your purposes because you're going to be filling it in. It's your double entry diary. Looks like this. If you have Roger, it's going to say Roger at the top. If you have Mrs. Jones, it's going to say Mrs. Jones at the top. This column right here, you're going to write down 4 to 5 quotes, moments in the story, instances that really strike you or make you go, I wonder why he or she did that. On this side, you're going to write a thought that you have about it. Maybe a question that occurs to you, a prediction, a connection, maybe even a connection to your own life on this side. And this is going to help us crack the code of these characters' motivations when we start talking about them as class. So I want 4 to 5 based on your character. It's either going to be Roger or Mrs. Jones. 4 to 5 separate instances or quotes on this side of the page, not one quote and then 4 or 5 reflections on it. You have to have at least 4 to 5 separate moments in the story, quotes, whatever you'd like, and then a matching reflection on the other side, okay? So if you've got your chart open, if you scroll up on the page, you will see that Mrs. Kinder has already done some examples for you. And I'm going to go through those with you right now so you have a better idea of what I expect from you. I always tell you that when I give you an assignment, I will always not only tell you what my expectation is from you, but even give you an example or really help you understand how to reach that expectation. And that's what we're going to do right now. So read along with me how I filled out my chart for Roger. That's who we're starting with. Scroll up, there's Roger. And you should have that in front of you from what I submitted through Blackboard. Okay, so for the purposes of talking about Roger, on this side, the first instance I chose was the opening scene in the story, which is when Roger tries to steal Mrs. Jones' purse. And when this happens, one of the first things that I think of is why. Why is he stealing? Is it because he's hungry? He wants money for food? Does he need something and he just doesn't have the money for it? Is this the thing he's done before? Does he do this kind of thing all of the time? Does he do it for the thrill? I don't know. When he fails to steal her purse and she grabs him and starts shaking him and is very angry, is he scared? Is he nervous? What's going through his mind? Does he think he's about to go to jail? I would be scared because it sounds like Mrs. Jones is not only a big lady, but she's pretty tough too. The second instance I chose is the moment that Roger takes the money that Mrs. Jones offers him towards the end of the story to buy shoes. I think at that moment, Roger must be really shocked that a woman who he just tried to rob minutes before is now offering him money for the very thing that he told her he was robbing her for. So here he was trying to take it from her. Now she's freely offering it to him. That must have shocked him. And I think he realizes that moment too that they have something in common. She actually kind of tells him that they do in the story. But we're talking about Roger and his motivation. And that she probably sympathizes with him. And so I wonder, do you really think Roger is going to take that money and buy the shoes that he says that he wanted? And if he does, every time he wears those shoes, is he going to think about Mrs. Jones and what happened between them? I wonder. Okay, so that's Roger. Everybody on this side of the room is doing Roger. There's your examples. I put my moments in the story here. Put my reflections here. Scroll up. Mrs. Jones is next. So everyone on this side of the room, here's your examples that Mrs. Kinder came up with for Mrs. Jones. Okay, so my first instance is I have Mrs. Jones dragging Roger down the street back to her house after this failed robbery. And my first question is, why take him to her house? Why not go straight to the police? And remember, Roger asked for that too. Are you going to take me to the police? So why does she decide to spare him from this encounter with the police and take him back to her home? Is she embarrassed that there were witnesses around or scared that they saw what was happening between them? Because Mr. Hughes mentions that there were people watching this encounter happen on the street. Is she afraid when she takes him back to her house that he might hurt her or steal something else from her house? I gotta tell you, I kind of don't think she is. She's a big lady and she's a tough lady. And I think she knows what she's doing when she brings Roger back to his house. My second instance I chose for Mrs. Jones is the moment that she decides to feed Roger dinner. And one thing that really stands out to me there is Mr. Hughes makes it obvious through his description of Mrs. Jones' home that she does not have a lot. She lives in a boarding house. She has a tiny little gas plate in the corner and a little ice box. So she doesn't even have like a real kitchen. So she lives very modestly, doesn't have a whole lot. And yet she chooses to share what little she has with this young man who just tried to steal from her. It's the only thing I can think is she must have really felt sympathy for Roger and felt a connection to him. You remember she tells him that he reminds her of her younger self, that there were things she wanted when she was a young person that she couldn't afford. And so definitely they have that connection. And it's kind of a moment for her to say to Roger too, I haven't always been this older woman. I was a younger person like you at one time, and I know what it feels like to want something and not be able to get it. in doing this, is she maybe thinking back to moments in her childhood when someone else treated her this way, when she didn't really deserve their sympathy or their affection or their moment where they shared with her, and yet they did it anyway, and maybe she's kind of paying that back a little bit through Roger. It's an interesting thought. So those were my observations about Roger and about Mrs. Jones. You're going to have to come up with your own, and there's plenty to choose from in this story. 4 to 5, like I said, on this side, reflections on the other side. Then here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to do that. When you're finished, as a group, we are going to discuss what you came up with. There are no right or wrong answers. This is about you and your observations and how you're connecting with the characters and trying to uncover their motivation. After we've spent some time talking about it and sharing it, I want us to use what we've learned about this character motivation to sort of crack the code of the theme of this story. I believe that when Mr. Hughes wrote this story, he had a message he wanted to get across to us, and he did it through these characters. I think we, through looking at their motivations in this story, can figure out what that theme is. And it's a great one, and it can teach us a lot about humans and about how people who come together in conflict can end up resolving that conflict in a very positive way. But I'm not going to say anything more about it because this is your turn to use this double entry diary strategy to try and crack the code yourself on character motivation, and then we'll work together to use the clues we've uncovered about these characters to crack the code of the theme and figure out exactly what it was that Langston Hughes wanted us to take away from the story. Thank you, ma'am. All right, good luck, everybody.